The wind howled a mournful tune across the desolate landscape of Utah in 1891, a constant, gritty companion to Silas, a man forged by the solitude of the mountains. He was a trapper, a hunter, a ghost of a man who found more comfort in the silent company of pines and the brutal honesty of the wilderness than in the unpredictable clamor of men. His cabin, a stoic sentinel against the elements, was his sanctuary, a testament to a life lived on the fringes. Silas was on his way back from setting traps, the scent of fresh pine and the promise of a coming blizzard heavy in the air, when he saw it, a glint of metal, unnatural against the brown and grey palette of the high desert. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of the knife on his hip as he approached the abandoned wagon. It was an anachronism, a broken vessel of shattered dreams, its wooden wheels splintered, a testament to a brutal ambush. Silence hung in the air, thick and heavy, a silence that spoke of violence, of a story cut short. He circled the wreckage, his senses on high alert, the crunch of his boots on the frozen ground the only sound. A low moan, barely audible, snagged on the wind and pulled him towards the back of the wagon. There, huddled beneath a torn tarpaulin, was a woman. Her clothes were shredded, caked in mud and grime, and a deep, angry gash marked her forehead. She was trembling, a raw, primal fear etched on her face. Her eyes, a startling blue against the dirt, met his, and a silent plea passed between them. Silas was a man of action, not of words. He knelt, his large, calloused hands gentle as he tried to assess her injuries. He knew nothing of this woman, nothing of her past, but the look in her eyes was one he understood, the look of someone pushed to the brink, of a life clinging on by a thread. He felt an unusual ache in his chest, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, empathy. "I'm Silas," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. He pulled the tarpaulin fully back and saw the full extent of her state. "Easy now." He moved to help her up, and she recoiled, flinching from his touch. Her face was a mask of suspicion, her body a coiled spring of fear. "I'm dirty, body and soul," she said, her voice a fragile whisper, a thread of shame running through her words. Silas paused, his eyes scanning her face, seeing not the dirt or the wounds, but the profound sadness beneath. He pulled back a piece of cloth to wipe her face, and as he did, his hand stumbled. The cut on her forehead, he saw, was not the most significant injury. There was a brand, a cruel, ugly mark seared into her skin, just above her eyebrow. It was the mark of a slave, a brand for an escaped human being. The sheer shock of the discovery hit him hard. This wasn't just a simple attack. This was a brutal, systematic destruction of a person, and a cruel reminder of the injustices of the world. A wave of disgust washed over him for the kind of men who would do this, and a new resolve took root in his heart. He didn't pull away. Instead, he gently continued to clean the grime from her face. He had seen many ugly things in his life, but this was different. This was a violation of the spirit. He looked at her, truly saw her for the first time. She was not just a survivor of a bandit attack, she was a survivor of a much deeper, more insidious evil. A person branded and sold, a person whose life had been a fight for freedom, only to be found by a man in the middle of nowhere. He didn't know how he could help her, but he knew he had to try. Silas's cabin, a single-room dwelling built with rough-hewn logs, was a beacon of warmth against the encroaching cold. He carried the woman, whose name she still hadn't offered, with a surprising gentleness, her slight frame almost weightless in his arms. He laid her on his simple cot, a pile of furs and blankets providing a soft bed. The fire in the hearth crackled and danced, casting long shadows that flickered across the room, illuminating his collection of furs and the few books that constituted his only connection to the outside world. Her shivering was relentless, a full-body shudder that rattled her teeth. He knelt by her side, pulling a flask of whiskey from his satchel. "Drink this," he commanded softly. "It'll help with the cold." She hesitated, her blue eyes wide with distrust, her hand trembling as she reached for the flask. The brand on her forehead seemed to stand out more in the firelight. It was a constant reminder of her past, a mark of ownership that defied the freedom she had fought for. "It's just whiskey," Silas reassured her, his voice a low, steadying presence. "To warm you." She took a small sip, a wince crossing her face as the harsh liquid burned its way down her throat. She closed her eyes, the warmth spreading through her limbs, and a small sigh escaped her lips. "My name is Ilara," she said, her voice still a fragile whisper. "Thank you, Silas." He simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the brand on her forehead. He wanted to ask about it, about the story it told, but he held his tongue. He knew some things were not for him to pry into. Instead, he focused on the present. He needed to clean her wounds and get her some food. Silas rummaged through his supplies, finding some clean rags and a bottle of antiseptic. He moved to her side, and she flinched again, a deep-seated fear of touch ingrained in her. He saw the battle waging in her eyes, the need for help against the terror of vulnerability. "I need to clean that cut," he said, his voice as calm as he could make it. "It's festering." Ilara nodded, her eyes closed, her body tense. Silas worked with a quiet efficiency, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he dabbed the antiseptic on the gash. It was a methodical, careful process, his movements slow and deliberate. He cleaned the grime from her face, her hands and her arms, revealing a fair skin beneath the dirt. The brand, however, remained, a dark stain on her beautiful face. When he was finished, he made her a simple meal of venison jerky and some hardtack biscuits. She ate slowly, her movements hesitant, her eyes never leaving him. The silence was thick, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of the wind. "How did you get here?" Silas finally asked, his voice low. Ilara put down her food, her gaze dropping to the floor. "The wagon broke down," she said, her voice emotionless. "The others, they were killed. It was a raid." She didn't mention the brand. She didn't have to. The story it told was 1,000 times more brutal than anything a simple bandit attack could conjure. "And the brand?" he asked, unable to contain his curiosity. She didn't answer right away. "It's from another time," she finally said, her eyes meeting his, a deep sadness in them. "A time I'm trying to leave behind." He understood. He knew what it was like to be haunted by a past you couldn't escape. He had his own demons, his own ghosts that kept him in the solitude of the mountains. He knew at that moment that their meeting was no accident. It was a collision of two broken people seeking a refuge from the cruel world that had left its mark on them. The snow fell in a thick, relentless curtain, a white blanket that covered the mountain and the world in a profound silence. It was a silence that was both comforting and suffocating, trapping Silas and Ilara in the small cabin. Days bled into one another, marked only by the dwindling daylight and the constant need to feed the fire. Ilara was a quiet presence, her movements tentative, her eyes always watching. She spent her days tending to her wounds, her gaze often fixed on the swirling snow outside the window. She was a woman of few words, but her silence spoke volumes. Silas, a man accustomed to solitude, found a new rhythm with her presence. He would go out to tend to his traps, returning with a rabbit or a deer, and find her by the fire, her eyes lost in thought. The cold was a tangible thing, seeping into the cabin through the cracks in the walls. Silas was accustomed to it, but Ilara shivered constantly, a deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to come from within. He would find her huddled close to the fire, a blanket wrapped around her, her face pale. One evening he found her sobbing, her body racked with tremors. He sat beside her, his large frame a reassuring presence in the small space. He didn't say anything, just put a hand on her shoulder. The touch was a jolt, a physical connection that she had long denied herself. She flinched, but then leaned into it, a silent request for comfort. "I can't do this," she whispered, the words choked with sobs. "I can't keep running. I can't keep pretending I'm not damaged." He knew she wasn't talking about her physical wounds. She was talking about the brand, about the fear, about the past that haunted her. He understood. He had his own scars, invisible but just as deep. "You're not damaged," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You're a survivor." Ilara laughed, a hollow sound devoid of any humor. A survivor of what? A life of slavery? A life of running? A life of being a thing, not a person? Silas's hand tightened on her shoulder. "A survivor of a world that tried to break you. A survivor who is still standing. That's not a thing. That's a person, a strong person." His words, so simple and true, seemed to pierce through the armor she had built around herself. She looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears, and saw not a trapper in a desolate cabin, but a man who saw her, truly saw her past the brand and the dirt and the fear. He saw the person she was, not the object she had been forced to be. The days continued to merge into a single long stretch of solitude, and the silence in the cabin began to be filled with the quiet comfort of two people sharing a space. Silas found himself talking more, telling Ilara stories of the mountains, of the wildlife, of the solitude he had chosen. Ilara, in turn, began to open up, a little at a time, revealing fragments of her past. She spoke of the plantation, the endless work, the constant fear. She spoke of her escape, a desperate, harrowing journey that had brought her to the brink of death. She told him of her brief, fragile moments of freedom, of the friends she had made along the way, and of the ultimate betrayal that had led to the raid on the wagon. Silas listened without judgment, his eyes fixed on her, a profound understanding in his gaze. He learned her story, and in doing so he began to see her not as a wounded woman he had rescued, but as a person of immense strength and courage. He saw her pain, but he also saw her resilience. The snow finally began to recede, a slow, grudging surrender to the approaching spring. With the thawing of the land came a thawing of the relationship between them. The initial distrust gave way to a quiet friendship, a bond forged in the crucible of shared solitude and trauma. They began to work together, their movements synchronized in the small space. He would go out and set traps, and she would tend to the fire and prepare the meager meals. Their conversations grew longer, less formal, their laughter a new welcome sound in the cabin. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, Silas found Ilara standing by the window, her hand tracing the outline of the mountain. He stood behind her, the silence between them no longer awkward but comfortable. "What will you do when the snow is gone?" he asked, his voice low. Ilara didn't answer right away. "I don't know," she finally said, her voice filled with an uncertainty that was both new and old. "Keep running, I suppose." Silas felt a familiar ache in his chest. The thought of her leaving, of returning to the solitude he had so long embraced, was suddenly unbearable. He didn't want to go back to a life without her. She was a light in the darkness he had created for himself, a glimmer of hope he hadn't known he was missing. He wanted to tell her to stay, to build a life with him in the quiet sanctuary of the mountains. But he couldn't. He knew her freedom was too precious to be confined. He reached out, his hand hovering over her shoulder. She turned, and their eyes met. In his, she saw a profound sadness, a longing she hadn't expected. In hers, he saw a mirroring of that sadness, a fear of the unknown, of a life she was not ready to face alone. He dropped his hand, and she instinctively reached out and grabbed it, her small, cold hand a contrast to his calloused one. "Silas," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I'm scared." It was a confession, a vulnerability she had not shown before. It was a plea for him to not let her go, to not return her to the cold, cruel world she had escaped. It was a promise of a future, a flickering hope that a different life was possible. The thaw was complete, the river running high and fast, its roar a constant backdrop to the life in the cabin. The forest was green again, and the air was filled with the scents of pine and wet earth. Ilara was stronger now, her wounds fully healed, her body no longer trembling with a deep-seated fear. She had found a new purpose in the cabin, helping Silas with his chores, her quiet efficiency a comfort to him. Their conversations were now filled with a new kind of intimacy. They spoke of their dreams, of the lives they had wanted for themselves. Ilara spoke of a small farm, of a life free from the fear of being hunted. Silas spoke of a life he had never thought possible, a life not defined by his solitude, but by a shared companionship. One day, as they were mending a fence near the edge of the woods, a rider approached. It was a local sheriff, a grizzled old man with a kind face. He was a familiar presence to Silas, a man he had traded with for years. The sheriff's gaze fell on Ilara, and a flash of curiosity crossed his face. "Silas," he said, his voice a low drawl, "didn't know you had company." Silas's body went rigid. He instinctively stepped in front of Ilara, his hand going to his knife. He knew the world was filled with men who would see a woman like Ilara and see an opportunity, a bounty. He knew the mark on her forehead was a beacon for those who sought to profit from others' misery. "She's my wife," Silas said, the words coming out without thought. "Just a bit shy." The sheriff's eyes narrowed, but he simply nodded. He knew Silas was a man of few words, and even fewer lies. He seemed to accept the explanation and moved on to the reason for his visit, a few missing goods from a recent supply run. As the sheriff rode away, Ilara's hand reached out and grabbed Silas's arm. Her eyes were wide with a mix of surprise and gratitude. He had called her his wife, a lie, but one that was a promise, a shield against a dangerous world. It was a gesture of protection, of a commitment he hadn't realized he was ready to make. "Why did you do that?" she whispered. Silas turned, his gaze fixed on her. "Because it's true," he said, his voice filled with an earnestness that was new to him. "You're my wife, Ilara. Not in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of my heart. I won't let anyone take you from me." Ilara's eyes filled with tears, a mix of joy and disbelief. She didn't say anything, but she reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines of his exhaustion and his care for her. In that small, silent gesture, a new promise was made, a different kind of bond was sealed. Life in the cabin had settled into a comfortable rhythm, a quiet domesticity that was a balm to their weary souls. Ilara had found her place, and the brand on her forehead, once a source of shame and fear, seemed to fade into a simple scar, a testament to a battle she had won. But their peace was a fragile thing, a delicate bird nesting in the shadow of a hawk. One afternoon, while Silas was out hunting, Ilara heard the sound of approaching horses. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a primal fear seizing her. She ran to the window and saw 3 riders, their faces hard and cruel, a look of grim determination in their eyes. She recognized one of them, the man who had led the raid on the wagon. He was the one who had put the brand on her face. She ran to the back of the cabin, her mind racing. There was no time to run, no time to hide. She grabbed Silas's shotgun from its place over the fireplace, her hands trembling as she loaded it. She knew she couldn't outrun them, and she wouldn't hide from them again. This was her home now, and she would fight for it, for her new life, for Silas. The riders dismounted, their footsteps heavy on the porch. The leader, a man named Cain, a cruel smile on his face, kicked the door in. He saw Ilara, the shotgun aimed at his chest, and laughed. "Well, look what we have here," he sneered, his eyes filled with a predatory glint. "The little runaway slave. Thought you could hide from us, didn't you?" "I'm not a slave anymore," Ilara said, her voice shaking, but her resolve steady. "I'm a free woman." "Not as long as you have our mark on your face," Cain said, his eyes going to the brand on her forehead. "You belong to us, little girl, and we've come to take you back." She knew they would kill Silas, a man who had done nothing but show her kindness. She had to protect him at all costs. "You're not taking me anywhere," she said, her voice finding its strength. "You're not taking anything from me again." She fired, the shotgun's roar a deafening sound in the small cabin. Cain screamed, clutching his shoulder. His two men drew their guns, and Ilara's heart sank. She had only one shot. But then, as if an answer to a silent prayer, the door behind them burst open. Silas was there, his face a mask of fury, a rifle in his hand. He didn't hesitate. He took aim, and the sound of his rifle filled the cabin, a sharp crack that echoed the first shot. One of the men went down, a bullet to his chest. The other man, seeing the ferocity in Silas's eyes, turned and ran. Cain, his face contorted in pain and rage, scrambled to his feet and followed his man, his hand still clutching his bleeding shoulder. The air in the cabin was thick with the scent of gunpowder and the raw adrenaline of the confrontation. Silas stood panting, his rifle still aimed at the empty doorway. Ilara dropped the shotgun, her legs giving out from beneath her. She sank to the floor, her body trembling with the aftershock of the fight. Silas knelt beside her, his large hands reaching out to steady her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with a desperate concern. Ilara nodded, tears streaming down her face, a mix of relief and terror. "They found me, Silas. They found me." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, her body a trembling mess against his. He knew this was not over. Cain would be back, and he would not be alone. The man had a deep-seated cruelty, and a loss of face would only make him more dangerous. He cleaned his rifle, his movements methodical, his mind racing. He had a choice to make. He could stay and fight, putting Ilara in even more danger, or he could take her away, find a new place, a new life, a new beginning. He had built his entire life around the solitude of the mountains, but now, with Ilara in his arms, the thought of leaving was not an act of surrender, but an act of love. "We have to go," he said, his voice low and firm. "We'll go north. Get to Canada. They can't touch you there." Ilara looked up at him, her eyes filled with a question. "But what about you? What about your life?" Silas looked around the cabin, at the life he had built, at the memories of his solitude. He had been a trapper, a hunter, a ghost of a man. But now he was a protector, a husband, a man with a purpose. "My life is with you, Ilara," he said, the words simple and true. "This is just a place. Home is where you are." They spent the rest of the day gathering their supplies, their movements a flurry of activity. They packed food, a few blankets, a spare rifle, and a few of Silas's most cherished books. As the sun set, they stood outside the cabin, the place that had been their sanctuary, their battlefield, and their home. Ilara looked at it, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "It was a good home," she said, her voice filled with a quiet finality. "We'll build another one," Silas said, his hand finding hers. "A better one." The journey north was long and arduous. They traveled at night, hiding during the day, a constant fear, a silent companion to their hope. The landscape changed, the desolate mountains giving way to lush forests, the air growing colder, the scent of pine replaced by the smell of damp earth and a faint scent of salt from the distant ocean. They were running, but it was a different kind of running. Before, Ilara had run alone, a hunted animal. Now she was running with Silas, a partner, a protector. They were a team, a small two-person army against a cruel and relentless world. One day they came across a small, isolated farm. A family, a kind elderly couple, welcomed them with a warm meal and a place to rest. Ilara and Silas were cautious, but the couple's kindness was genuine. They spoke of the new life they had built for themselves, of the freedom of the land, of the simple pleasures of a life lived away from the chaos of the cities. The couple's story was a balm to their weary souls. It gave them hope, a glimpse into a life they could have for themselves, a life of peace and quiet. But the fear remained. The brand on Ilara's forehead was a constant reminder of the past, a mark that could bring a bounty hunter down on them at any moment. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, Ilara looked at Silas, her eyes filled with a new kind of fear. "What if they find us? What if they hurt you?" Silas took her hand, his thumb tracing the lines on her palm. "They won't," he said, his voice firm. "We're almost there, and even if they do, we'll fight them, together." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small, worn book. It was his father's Bible, a treasure he had carried with him for years. He opened it and pulled out a small, flat stone. "My father found this on a beach, said it had a strange power, a power to wash away the past." He said it with a half-smile, a hint of his old cynical self. But he placed the stone in her hand, his fingers enclosing hers around it. "Maybe it will wash away the mark," he whispered. It was a foolish hope, he knew. But he needed her to have hope, a belief that a new life was possible, that her past was not her future. The truth was, the mark was not on her forehead, but in her heart. And only she could wash it away. The air was colder now, a crisp, clean chill that spoke of a new country. They were close to the Canadian border, a mere day's journey away. The sense of relief was palpable, a heavy weight lifting from their shoulders. But their relief was short-lived. As they were making camp for the night, they heard the sound of horses. Silas's hand went to his rifle. He knew who it was. The same three men, their faces etched with a vengeful fury. Cain was at the front, his face pale with a seething rage. "You thought you could run from us, didn't you, you pathetic mountain man?" he snarled. "You thought you could take what's ours?" Silas stood his ground, his rifle aimed at Cain's chest. "She's not yours," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "She's free." Cain laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "That brand on her face says otherwise." Ilara stepped out from behind Silas, her body rigid, her eyes fixed on Cain. She looked at him, not with fear, but with a quiet, steely resolve. "The brand is just a mark," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It doesn't define me. You don't own me." Cain's laughter died in his throat. He saw the change in her, the strength, the resolve. He had come to take back a slave, but he found a woman, a person, a free soul. He raised his gun, his face a mask of fury. "I don't care what you think you are," he spat. "You're still worth a good price to me. Now step aside, old man, or I'll kill you right here." Silas didn't move. He stood his ground, his rifle unwavering. "You'll have to go through me." The final confrontation was brutal and quick. Silas, a man of the mountains, was a more skilled marksman than any city-bred criminal. He took down one of the men with a single shot. Cain, seeing his companion fall, let out a howl of rage and charged. The second man, seeing the ferocity in Silas, turned and ran. Cain came at Silas with a knife, and Silas, his own knife drawn, met him head-on. The fight was a blur of motion, a clash of steel and will. Silas fought with a raw, primal ferocity, fueled by a desire to protect Ilara, to give her the freedom she had fought so hard for. He fought not for himself, but for her, for their future. He was no longer the lonely trapper, but a man fighting for his family. He finally overpowered Cain, the man falling to his knees, defeated. Silas looked at him, his chest heaving. "Now, get out," he said, his voice hoarse, "and don't ever come back." The sun rose the next morning, a golden orb that cast a warm glow over the rolling hills of Canada. Silas and Ilara crossed the border in the early morning light, a silent, somber pair. They walked for a few more hours, their steps lighter, their hearts filled with a profound sense of peace. The world was different now. The air felt cleaner, the sky seemed bluer, and the sun felt warmer. They stopped by a small, crystal-clear stream, and Ilara knelt down, cupping her hands and splashing the cold water on her face. She looked at her reflection in the water, at the brand on her forehead, and she smiled. It was still there, but it was just a mark now, a scar from a life she had survived. It was no longer a symbol of shame, but a testament to her resilience, a reminder of the darkness she had left behind. She looked at Silas, his face filled with a quiet contentment, his eyes fixed on her. He had saved her, not just from the bandits, but from her past, from the shame that had branded her soul. He had shown her that she was not dirty, not body and soul, but a person worthy of love and respect. "Silas," she said, her voice filled with a profound gratitude, "thank you." He knelt beside her, his hand finding hers. "You didn't need me to save you, Ilara," he said, his voice soft. "You saved yourself. I just kept you company." He was a man of few words, but in that simple statement he spoke a truth that was more powerful than any grand declaration. He hadn't seen her as a project to be fixed, but as a person, a partner. They rose and walked on, their hands clasped together, their footsteps a silent promise to a future they would build together. They had lost their past, their home, their old lives. But they had found something new, something better. They had found each other, a family in a world that had tried to tear them apart. They had found a future, a new life in a new land, a life free from the ghosts of the past, a life filled with hope, love, and the promise of a light that would never go out.